starts at 8 tonight with the TED Radio Hour, which explores the notion of systemic change and what that looks like. At 9 o'clock on the Planet Money, How I Built This Hour, hear the real origin story of monopoly. It actually started out as a critique of capitalism. That's our evening lineup. Starts at 8 on 93.9 FM. You can live stream everything, too, at WNYC.org. 41 degrees, cloudy right now in New York City.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's Thursday, February 23rd. I'm Trisha Stortz. On today's show, navigating the hurdles of opening a cannabis dispensary in New York City.
So how do I go legit? Give me what I need so I can pay taxes and be legit. That's all we want.
Weed has been legal in the state for almost 2 years, but as of this month, the city only has 3 dispensaries. Also today, residents of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn weigh in on rebuilding the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway.
It is the very first time, really, that the city is reaching out and saying, we want to hear your opinion, your voice.
Tomorrow marks 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Here in New York City, Ukrainians reflect on the past.
My brain felt like roasted potatoes, and I was physically present here, but mentally I was in Ukraine. I tried to speak to them.
All this and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Alec Murdaugh concedes he lied to investigators but maintains he did not commit murder. Today, the once prominent South Carolina former attorney took the stand in his defense against charges that he murdered his wife and one of his sons. As South Carolina Public Radio's Victoria Hansen reports, Murdaugh testified in part to attempt to explain his shattered alibi in which he previously told investigators he was not at the crime scene the night of the killings.
Video taken from the cell phone of Murdaugh's murdered son shows a video in which Murdaugh's voice can be heard along with the victims moments before they were killed. The defense immediately addressed the issue.
Mr. Murdaugh, is that you? On the kennel video at 8:44 p.m. on June 7th, the night Maggie and Paul were murdered.
It is.
Murdaugh admits he lied to investigators about being at the crime scene before discovering the bodies of his loved ones. The 54-year-old says he was on opioids and paranoid about investigators' questions. Still, Murdaugh denies having anything to do with the murders. If convicted, the former attorney faces anywhere from 30 years to life behind bars without parole. For NPR News, I'm Victoria Hansen in Walterboro.
Disgraced movie mogul Harvey Weinstein is getting more prison time. Jurors in Los Angeles convicted Weinstein today of raping and sexually assaulting an actress and model. The 70-year-old is ordered to serve 16 years in prison after he completes the remainder of his 30-year sentence in New York for similar crimes. The founder of the embattled digital startup Aussie Media has been arrested and charged with fraud. Carlos Watson was scheduled to be arraigned in federal court in New York this afternoon. After the company was exposed for possible fraud, it lost millions of dollars before it was shut down. Watson had previously served on NPR's board until he resigned in 2021 following the public meltdown of his company. At the time, Watson criticized the New York Times expose on Aussie. He said the story was, quote, profoundly inaccurate. On the eve of the first anniversary of the start of the war in Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country will boost its nuclear forces. The announcement follows an earlier decision to suspend Russia's membership in a key nuclear arms agreement with the U.S. NPR's Charles Maines has more from Moscow.
In a speech to mark the Defender of the Fatherland holiday, Putin said Russia would replenish its conventional arms and strengthen its nuclear triad of intercontinental missiles capable of launching from air, land, and sea. The move follows Putin's decision to suspend Russian participation in the New START treaty, the lone remaining nuclear arms agreement with the U.S. Moscow insists the future of the nuclear treaty now rests with Washington and its allies, reconsidering their military support for Kyiv as the war in Ukraine reaches the 1-year mark. Putin has reframed Russia's invasion as an existential threat from Western powers intent on seizing Russia's historical lands. Charles Maines, NPR News, Moscow.
This is NPR.
In New York, I'm Thomas Copeland. Nearly all drivers searched or arrested by the NYPD last year were people of colour. 9 out of 10 were black or Latino. That's according to new data obtained by the New York Civil Liberties Union. Nearly 15,000 drivers were arrested overall, and critics say that drivers of colour are being singled out. The The NYPD defends the use of vehicle stops as a key public safety tool. Long Island Congressman George Santos has co-sponsored a bill to make the AR-15 the national gun of the United States. There are an estimated 20 million AR-15s in circulation across the country. This style of rifle has been used in some of the most high-profile mass shootings of recent years, including at Tops Supermarket in Buffalo last year. Governor Kathy Hochul has described the congressman's sponsorship as outrageous and appalling. Santos has yet to comment publicly on the bill. The founder and chief executive of Aussie Media has been arrested on federal fraud charges. Prosecutors allege that Carlos Watson directed a scheme to defraud investors out of millions of dollars. Aussie Media shut down in 2021 after a New York Times investigation alleged that as part of his deception, Watson had impersonated a YouTube executive on a fundraising call with Goldman Sachs. This comes just days after another former Aussie Media executive, Samir Rao, pleaded guilty to separate fraud charges. More than 140,000 New Jersey residents will find out tomorrow morning whether they will be placed on a wait list for subsidised housing. Just 15% of those applicants will make the list. They were selected by lottery. Applicants will be notified via email, or they can check their status online, and it still could take months or years before they receive assistance. Tonight, the New York Knicks are hoping to extend their 3-game win streak as they face the Washington Wizards in D.C. This is the third showdown between the two teams this season. The Wizards came out on top at their last match-up in January. And in weather news, cloudy skies with a low of 42 degrees. Thomas Copeland, Columbia Radio News.
Welcome back. This is Uptown Radio. I'm Trisha Stortz. Driving the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway is rarely an enjoyable experience. There's the traffic, the tiny lanes, the huge trucks, and the looming fear that parts of it might collapse. But, as Isabel Tier reports, planning to fix the crumbling infrastructure are underway. And this time, communities along the BQE corridor might actually have a say.
The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway was built in the 1930s and 40s. It goes from Astoria, Queens, to here, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn.
This is where sort of Brooklyn ends or begins, depending on how you look at it.
That's Mohammed Zinn, the program director at Bay Ridge Community Development Center.
I grew up, I would say, a few blocks away from the BQE, walking distance, really.
Today, Mohammed is hosting a community forum to ask the residents here what they want from a new and improved BQE. He pulls up a PowerPoint with a grid of images, like a menu in a restaurant. Does the community want a new BQE to be underground, or filled with green spaces, or more shopping areas? And the 25 people here discuss it.
That's the city. You take what you can.
This is the first of many workshops Mohammed will help facilitate throughout the year. And his findings will be submitted in quarterly reports to the city's Department of Transportation, which, in theory, will guide their design process. In other words, right now, the BQE corridor vision has no official plans they've proposed. The Adams administration refers to this period of community engagement as a visioning process. And while this might seem naive to some New Yorkers, it is the very step that was ignored when Robert Moses first carved the BQE through the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, forever altering the borough. Bibi Issac, the executive director of the Bay Ridge Community Development Center, is hopeful about the future of the project.
It is the very first time, really, that the city is reaching out and saying, we want to hear your opinion, your voice as to what you think, this could look like and what it should look like. And I think that's important to finally be at the table.
Mohammed is more conflicted. In one way, he's also hopeful.
You see some of these projects, like we looked at these different cities that have these super beautiful highways and these super beautiful, neighborhoods around the highway. And I'm just wondering, why can't we have the same thing?
But at the same time, he's skeptical about whether his community's voice will actually be heard.
What I feel is that they already sort of have an idea of what they want to do, and they know what it is they're going to execute on. But they're just taking this step to try to see what people are thinking. But I think that everything is already sort of finalized.
The meeting ended with a promise that the community comments would be compiled and submitted with their quarterly report. The first item on the BQE rebuilding agenda is the Brooklyn Heights Triple Cantilever. That's the multi-story part of the highway that looks kind of like a wedding cake. Construction is set to begin within 5 years. And while there isn't an official design yet, if they listen to the people of Bay Ridge, there should be some green space. Isabel Tier, Columbia Radio News.
This week, an anti-abortion group in Texas filed a lawsuit against the FDA that may limit access to abortion pills across the country. Julie Blake is a member of the group filing the lawsuit, the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. She says the abortion pill needs to be reassessed for safety.
We're asking the court to order the FDA to remove these drugs from the market, or at a minimum to restore important safeguards on their use.
Here in New York, the people who run abortion clinics are worried about the implications of the lawsuit. Merle Hoffman, the CEO of Choices Medical Center, a clinic in Queens, explains what she's up against.
Well, they really want to ban mifepristone, which is one part of the two-part regime for the abortion pill. Okay, so you have mifepristone and misoprostol. And we've been using this for over 20 years, and it's about 95% effective. And it's really been utilized as a fallback after Roe fell. And 51 or 52% of women now in the first trimester are using abortion pills. So, of course, the opposition, the anti-choice fascist opposition, seemingly one step ahead, has found a way to take away that procedure. And the plaintiff now is saying, well, we want to override the FDA's approval, of mifepristone, which has been heavily based on scientific studies and usage for over 20 years.
So the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine filing the lawsuit are saying there are safety concerns with the pill. What's wrong with occasionally reassessing medications like this?
The reassessment is really not necessary because what we had was years of scientific study, years of comparative groups of women who have taken it, who attested the fact that this is a safe method of abortion. There's nothing wrong with reassessing, but this is the first time that this has been done. Now, you have to really realize that abortion pills now are on a medical, legal, and moral precipice.
So there are other ways to access abortion, including other pills. Would this really close the option off to anyone?
Okay, the other way to use medical abortion is misoprostol. You've got two drugs, right? They're going after mifepristone, which makes the regime far more effective. So we're left with the misoprostol. Now, what's the problem with that medication? The problem with that, taking that pill alone, which we have used and providers and physicians have used prior to RU, mifepristone, is that it's between 80 and 93 or 94% effective. So that means that women who take that are far more at risk to continuing their pregnancy, to having ectopic pregnancies. They have to have surgical abortion as a backup. If they're living in states where there's no access to that, they're in trouble.
Since this is a federal lawsuit, are there state-level workarounds?
Yes, well, we try to do state-level workarounds, but let's say the judge rules in the favor of the anti-abortion lawsuit. It will be appealed, obviously, and it will go up. And guess where it's going to land? It's going to land at the same Supreme Court that overturned Roe. So we're looking at a cliffhanger. Yes, we have to work vigorously on a state-by-state level, but I have been consistently pushing this as a national issue. We cannot have this human civil right for all women and girls just ripped away from us and just fight it on a state-by-state level. We have to keep that focus on national.
That was Merle Hoffman, founder and CEO of Choices Women's Medical Center. Thanks so much for being with us.
Always. Thank you very much.
This summer, incarcerated people will have the opportunity to apply for money from the federal government to go to college in prison. A couple of years ago, Congress lifted a ban on Pell Grants for the convicted. Now, nearly 500,000 incarcerated people could get up to $7,500 grants. Advocates say it will be money well spent. B-Tran reports.
When Wilfredo Larocuente got out of Sing Sing Correctional Facility in July 2021, after 20 years, he was also a recent college grad.
Higher education saved my life.
It took him almost a decade while being incarcerated in 2 different prisons to earn his degree in behavioral science from Mercy College.
Opportunity taken.
Today, he works as an assistant coordinator at Columbia University's Center for Justice. He now advocates for prisoners, and he says it matters because those who have the opportunity to get a college degree are less likely to go back to prison. The Pell Grants will help, but prisoners haven't had the opportunity to get Pell Grants since the early 1990s. That was when the government started taking a tough on crime approach that didn't include funding for higher education for prisoners. However, recently, according to a report by the Vera Institute, a nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform and the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, the number of prisoners who would be eligible for Pell Grants is still pretty small compared to the general population. However, it is a long-term bargain.
Education in prison and for people who are incarcerated results in a much lower rate of recidivism.
Nani Panucha is an academic advisor at the Justice in Education of Columbia University.
It provides for them a very a new and more successful in the sense that they are better integrated presence in
Pell Grants from the federal government don't need to be paid back. They are exclusively for higher education. And with the news that prisoners can apply for them starting this summer, Wilfredo Lara Cuente says it's about time.
I really think, honestly, it's about time because the way higher education was constructed the last 5 or 6 years prior to this happening, you really had to be at certain different facilities in order to kind of restart or begin your higher education. And then after you work on yourself, you can become the best possible version of yourself to get ready for release.
And a version of yourself that statistically won't end up back in prison. Vitran, Columbia Radio News.
And now, a slice of the city.
It must just look like really old, and there must be a Spider-Man on it, I guess. The first time I came to the city, I've been looking for one, and I found out they're like really hard to get. So since then, I've basically had my mind on finding a vintage Spider-Man t-shirt.
Martin Vanderklau, Dutchman and owner of a vintage Spider-Man t-shirt.
I mean, I've been going to almost every vintage shop, I think, in the city. I paid $105 for it. It only has like one small hole, and it has a big Spider-Man on the front swinging through the city.
You're listening to Uptown Radio, Thursdays at 4.
Tomorrow marks the one-year commemoration of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Over the past year, 8 million Ukrainians have fled their country, and despite billions of dollars of foreign aid for the war, Ukraine still hasn't regained its sovereignty. Ukrainians in New York are asking for moral support as they continue to protest the conflict from afar. Elizabeth Erb reports from the East Village.
Even a year after the war began, signs of solidarity still line the walls of Veselka, a popular restaurant in Little Ukraine. Our hearts beat for Ukraine, and Stand with Ukraine hang proudly under the string of blue and yellow flags. Vitaly Desenchenko is a manager here. He was working at Veselka when the invasion began. Desenchenko was shocked the war was really starting and went home to call his parents who were still in Kyiv.
I couldn't believe, realize, and accept what was happening. I felt like my brain felt like roasted potatoes, and I was physically present here, but mentally I was in Ukraine.
It took him a while to accept the reality, but now, a year later, he wants people to understand this conflict is more than just two countries.
Yeah, I think it's a bigger concern of the whole world, fighting terrorism and fighting for humanity rights and fighting for the peace in the whole world.
Alexander Krapinkin is doing just that. He's co-organizing rallies across 65 U.S. cities this week. Krapingfin works for an organization called Klitsch that hopes to raise awareness of the continued war.
Our rallies are not only for Ukrainians. Our rallies are for Americans. At some point, your money runs out, right? At some point, you can't help financially anymore. The only way that you can is morally.
He's organizing these protests because he knows firsthand how these conflicts impact people. His family fled Ukraine because of religious persecution 20 years ago.
One morning we woke up and there was a Star of David and tar on our door. So overnight somebody had marked the house as like, the Jews live there.
His family made it safely to the U.S., but many of his relatives are still in Ukraine. And when the invasion happened, he felt he needed to get involved.
A year ago, what did you think you'd be doing this week? Oh, gosh. Oh. February 23rd, because it was February 23rd, when at 11 p.m. around then, I was going to sleep, getting ready to wake up really early to go manage a medical clinic. That week, everything changed drastically.
And for Krapingfin, the one-year anniversary is a chance to remind people that Ukrainians are still asking for solidarity in this conflict. Tonight, 1 year later, he's headed to a candle vigil at the Russian consulate in New York. Events are planned throughout the city the rest of the week. Elizabeth Erb, Columbia Radio News.
The New York City Council has declared that the oldest gay bar in the city is now a historical landmark. Giuseppe Macias has more from Greenwich Village.
Julius Bar opened in 1930 on the corner of West 10th and Waverly Place. It didn't start out as a gay bar, but as the neighborhood changed in the 1960s, it became a popular hangout for gay men. Problem was, state law at the time made it illegal to serve alcohol to gay people. So in 1966, patrons organized what they called a sip-in protest to demand that New York change its laws. Before the Stonewall Uprising, the sip-in protest became one of the most talked about protests in the LGBTQ equal rights movement. For the last 10 years, organizations have been pushing to make the bar a historic landmark. Today, as the landmark status was finalized, I asked people in the neighborhood how they would celebrate.
I think it's awesome. I think we need to respect all these old establishments.
Now that the bar is a landmark, it means that nothing can change about the place without city approval. There's already a historical plaque outside, and in the window it declares, "Celebrating with pride today and every day."
That was Giuseppe Macias reporting from Greenwich Village. New York City's newest legal cannabis dispensary opened this month. It's just the third store to open its doors, but nearly 2 years after cannabis was legalized in the state, why are there still so few? Thomas Copeland reports.
Next stop, Rockaway.
When you walk off the ferry terminal on Rockaway, you'll quickly spot a small school bus parked nearby. It's painted black. It belongs to Omar Herrera, self-confessed cannabis connoisseur.
My birthday is the National Marijuana Day, 4/20, April 20th. You know, I found that out. It kind of made me fell in love with the plant more, you know, because it was like, wow, like I felt connected to it.
Herrera says he started smoking cannabis as a child and selling it as a teenager. Inside the bus, there's a plywood shop counter. Today, there's plenty in stock. Lighters in every colour, grinders, paper, the lot.
All the necessities, the supplies that a cannabis smoker needs.
Except for one thing. A freshly painted sign in the window reads, "No cannabis for sale." That's because in December, Herrera was arrested for selling cannabis. The cops found over a pound of cannabis plant, nearly 300 pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes, and 49 bags of gummies and cookies on the bus. Herrera doesn't have a license to sell cannabis, but he wants one.
So how do I go legit? Give me what I need so I can pay taxes and be legit. That's all we want.
Licenses for legal cannabis stores are issued by the State Office of Cannabis Management, or OCM. They say that the rollout of licenses is specifically designed to help communities which have been harmed by decades of cannabis criminalisation. So, they've been limiting the eligibility for the first round of licenses. To qualify, the applicant had to have owned a profitable business and be able to afford the $2,000 fee. Plus, either they or a family member had to have been convicted of a cannabis-related offence before legalisation. Ryan Sakis runs Empire Cannabis Consulting. He helps illegal sellers navigate their way into the legal market.
People have said that basically the person would have to be, a unicorn to fit those eligibility requirements.
Sakis says the OCM's approach is admirable. but it has slowed things down. Just 56 individual licences have been issued so far. Trevette Knowles from the OCM says the agency is brand new and they're trying to build a complicated industry in the right way.
We have to understand that every single thing that New York does towards cannabis legalization is through an equity lens, right? Any person who's recognized the harms of the war on drugs has also recognized that the state has some type of responsibility in undoing those harms in any capacity.
So, what about Omar Herrera? He comes from exactly the type of community that Knowles is talking about, and he says he wants to get a licence. But he can't. Remember, to qualify, you had to have been convicted before legalisation. Herrera was arrested after that.
I, unfortunately didn't have a conviction before it was legal. It was just an arrest, so I don't fall into that category.
When I asked Knowles whether convictions that sellers like Herrera are facing could actually ruin their chances of getting a licence in the future, I couldn't get a clear answer. As for Herrera, there's only so much he will tell me on tape, but he says he's been in this business too long to stop now.
The patience is I'm done with being patient. I'm done with that, because now if you don't take what's yours, someone else is going to take it. And that's the New York mentality, man.
The OCM says that a general licence, open for everyone, is coming soon, but not for another 6 months. Herrera is due in court next week. Thomas Copeland, Columbia Radio News.
That's it for this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show. Our executive producer today was Valentina Zarens Martinez. Leading our staff of reporters was senior producer Henrietta McFarlane. Director V. Tran coordinated our studio production team. Our producer, Isabel Tier, led our copy team and assisted in the studio. Thomas Copeland delivered our local newscast, and day reporters Elizabeth Erb and Yezepa Macias brought you the latest on the ground in New York. Our instructors Sally Herships, Robert Smith, and Lydia McMullen-Laird advised our staff. I'm Trisha Stortz. Uptown Radio is live Thursdays at 4. Until next week, you can always find us at uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.